Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the All Things Policy podcast. I am Arindam Goswami, your host for today. I work as a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution. In today's episode, we'll discuss about innovation policy, private sector R&D, and AI in general. We'll look at the impact of AI on innovation and other aspects of AI also. In today's world of techno-nationalism, where technological supremacy is considered to be an indicator of a country's prowess, and in the ever-evolving landscape of technological advancement, innovation and private sector research and development has become the backbone of economic growth. Recent developments in artificial intelligence have dramatically accelerated this innovation cycle. We've seen AI tools transform everything from drug discovery to software development, enabling researchers and developers to work faster and tackle increasingly complex challenges. It's a fascinating new world, and to discuss all this and much more, I have with me today Abhishek Nagaraj, who is an associate professor in the Management and Organizations and the Entrepreneurship and Innovation group at Berkeley Haas. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's earned his PhD in management at the MIT Sloan School of Management in the Technological Innovation, Entrepreneurship and Strategic Management group, and he also holds an MBA from IIM Calcutta. His research is in the area of innovation management and entrepreneurship. His research studies the power and limits of data-driven decision-making and AI on innovation and creativity in a variety of different contexts. All of this matches perfectly with the topic that we want to discuss in today's podcast, and it is my pleasure to welcome Abhishek, who, may I also add, is a very good friend of mine and a classmate from school till college. Welcome, Abhishek. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Arindam, both for the invitation and for that wonderful introduction. We go back a really long time, so it's really fun to be able to reconnect and to sit back and chat about some of these topics that are so close to my heart.
Yeah. Looking great. Looking forward to this conversation, and I hope listeners too will enjoy it. So yeah, let's dive into it. My first question to you is, what is the role and impact of innovation on the economic growth trajectory of nations, right? So why is innovation so important? Just to give an example of the mobile manufacturing companies in India, for example, right? If you look at their interviews or even what they've said, for them, innovation, for example, is not such an important aspect because they have a huge domestic market to tend to, right? And if you ask them, they would probably say that they're making money out of accessing the domestic market and they don't really need to invest in innovation as such, right? But then there have been studies which have shown the impact of innovation on economic growth of a country. What are your views on the impact of innovation as such?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the fundamental reasons why I'm a researcher of innovation and why all of those of us who study this topic find it so fascinating is because over the years and decades, in some ways, we've become really convinced that the bedrock of economic growth, the ways in which countries move out of poverty and into the next level of development, and even developed countries, if they wanted to get further, it really has its base in innovation. To understand why, we first must just take a look at that word a little bit, like what does innovation really mean? So if you think about economic processes, a lot of it is about converting input to output. Right, so you can think about, you mentioned mobile manufacturing, right? So there's a variety of different inputs you need to make mobile phones. And then on the other side, you get the mobile phone, and there's a dynamic of productivity there, right? Like, so given a certain amount of inputs, how many outputs can you produce? And growth really is tied to, okay, now I can produce more mobile phones, I can sell more mobile phones, and so therefore the size of my company is going to grow. Or more generally, the size of my economy is going to grow. It turns out that the biggest way to make an impact on this growth equation is not so much is by changing that productivity dynamic, right? So one ways in which you can grow is try to find more and more input and just produce more outputs. But it turns out that increasing productivity is a much stronger way, right? So getting more outputs out of the same amount of inputs in order to grow. And this seems very abstract, but really when it comes to innovation, it's about that process. So you can think about two types of innovation, process and product innovation. Process innovations are doing something that we always do, producing things that we always do, but producing them much more efficiently in a much more in a different way. For example, uh, why did we get the COVID vaccine so quickly? Is because the ways in which we discovered vaccines was completely different now. Because now we can analyze genomic sequences of how the vaccine works. And in a day, we knew exactly what the COVID virus looked like. And so the process through which this happened was very different. And there's also product innovation, which is smartphones as a category didn't exist, right? Before we all had those old Nokia phones.
Right.
And so another aspect of innovation was actually discovering or inventing new products that had a big market as compared to before. So really growth, and this goes back historically, has been the bedrock of innovation. One last point I'll make is researchers, economic historians have studied growth, and for centuries, growth was pretty stagnant, right? So we didn't, the whole world did not grow that much till the 1800s when the Industrial Revolution happened. And almost all of our growth that we enjoy today links back to only 100 or 200 years ago. So that really points to the power of things like you mentioned, electricity and everything that came from that in transforming our world. And I think we are standing on the on the brink of hopefully kind of what's called the second or the third industrial revolution, where we can use these new technologies to fuel growth in the same way. So it's really kind of a magic trick innovation because it keeps you giving more and more output out of a similar amount of inputs, which is why it's kind of such an exciting field to study.
Right, right. Before we come to India specific factors, what are the factors that drive innovation as such, right? So
Yeah.
there's the aspect of creative insecurity, right, which played out in the 1960s and in those times because of the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Because of which we've seen NASA and DARPA and all those other engines of innovation, right? Even now, in today's context of the tech wars and trade wars between US and China, we see a lot of creative insecurity fueling a lot of innovation, right? Even the recent example of DeepSeek, coming up with much more optimized models because of the fact that it didn't have a lot of access to the cutting edge chips, right? So what are such factors that you think contribute to innovation, right? Apart from even creative insecurity? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a super insightful question. And I will point out it's already you're ahead of the game when you even ask the question of like what drives innovation. Because if you ask a kind of a naive layperson, where do new ideas come from or where do new inventions come from? The stories that we tell our kids are very much of the eureka moment, right? Of the single scientist or single innovator sitting alone in a garage and then trying to dream up new ideas and just waiting for inspiration to strike. If that's your model of innovation, then nothing matters, right? You just have to get lucky or be smart enough in order to create innovation.
Right.
Research has proven over and over again that's the wrong way to think about it. Innovation is very much like any other industry or any other activity, but the more you invest in it and the more systematic you are, the more outputs that you'll get on the other hand. So that's, I think, a first factor that our policymakers need to understand is even though the outputs of innovation seem magical or seem like they came out of a genie's lamp, a lot of groundwork has to happen, but there is a direct linkage between investment and output. Now, what are those investments? Like, what are the kinds of things that do lead to better innovation? And really, it's a very holistic process. The one ways in which I like to think about it is to go from very, very basic topics to very applied and commercial topics. And you need stakeholders in pretty much all of those different sectors. So on the basic side, universities and human capital capacity has a big role to play. So everything from how we educate our kids, starting in the schools, to the level of basic research happening in labs, universities, and also industry has a big role to play. The second big is industry. So the role of industry is often to identify promising basic technologies and do the work of actually translating them and making them commercializable. We talked about mobile phones. Steve Jobs didn't invent any of the fundamental technologies behind the iPhone. The GPS was already there, the transistor was already there, the capacitive screen was already there. But the role of Apple there was in their R&D labs was to think about how to put all of these things together in a really compelling form factor, right? And we see this in the drug industry, where pharmaceutical companies are not doing the basic research themselves, but drawing on this fundamental base in order to make commercializable applications. So without that step, we don't really get the fruits of basic research. And finally, governments and institutions have a tremendous role to play in supporting both of these factors, right? So broadly, I think about those three as like the fundamental pillars of investment. Government investment through R&D subsidies, through supporting universities, industry, and basic research as the three pillars of driving innovation. Now you mentioned political factors, right? Like, so competition between countries, immigration will come up. There's lots of these other factors that shape innovation. But fundamentally, the channels through which they do so is through one of these three key sets of institutions, right? And so, for example, the government might start to invest more if they're worried about another country eating their bacon in a particular field. And so, as policymakers who might be listening to this, thinking about how can we invest in all of those three engines is a very important way to think about supporting and promoting innovation.
Right. From this flows my next question, especially in the context of India, but in general also. What do you think about governments shouldering a huge responsibility when it comes to innovation, right? So in India, the bulk of the investment in R&D comes from the government, right? Which is contrary to how it happens in the world, and especially in the developed countries, right? So our investment in R&D itself is quite abysmal. It's just 0.7%
Yeah.
of GDP, but almost 80% of it is from the government, right? Whereas in the US and other places, it's the reverse, right? Even now, while we have started, for example, getting in more private sector involvement in, say, the space sector, right, vis-a-vis ISRO and in space and other such policy, innovations that are coming up in India. But even now, we have research in India that's being done by government laboratories like CSIR laboratories, DRDO, and others, right? Even as we speak, there's the Aero India show that's happening here, and on display here probably will be the Tejas and others, right, which have been developed by HAL. But they've taken like so long, right? So just wanted to get your ideas on, is public sector investment in R&D that cost effective? If not, then what is the role of governments in public sector in R&D in general? So governments generally typically do produce, regulate, and finance sort of functions, right? So in the case of innovation, what do you think their remit should be?
Yeah, so I think I'm a big proponent of public sector investment in innovation. So even though it seems that it's kind of slow and maybe not efficient, and a lot of it does not produce the outcomes that you want, what we need to remember is that investment in innovation does not have a linear outcome. You're very much like a venture capitalist, right? So venture capitalist does not make their money back by getting 10% on every startup they invest in. Usually one startup pays back the entire fund. Like 9 out of 10 of them will fail and one of them will be really successful. And the same is true of very basic research that governments need to fund, right? I think India's big problem is not so much that the government is a bigger share, although that is a problem, but it's just that the overall level of investment is much smaller. And also, it isn't obvious if we were to increase that investment, where that would go, right? Because is there that capacity, both in industry and private sector, to absorb that increased level of investment, right? And so we have to think carefully about it being step by step. One actor can't dramatically increase investment while the others stay far behind. Um, but having said that, study after study has shown that average returns to government spending are positive and significantly positive, right? And so, but the mechanism through which that happens is usually as a portfolio rather than any one investment. And also, these returns can be slow, right? So these are not the things that you'll see a return like you build a road and the next year people are getting the benefits of that, and the politician can see that people are happy about it. The challenge with public investments in innovation are they're very diffuse and long term and hard to trace back to the original dollar or the original rupee spent. Although careful studies have shown that that kind of investment can have a big return. And so so I think we need to have a discussion about how one increases that overall investment. And also one needs to understand the non-linearities involved in measuring the value of the investment. But that's kind of my overall view. The research actually supports, and there are estimates out there of doubling or tripling the value of a given investment as compared to what was spent originally.
So the question wasn't about the government financing, because I think that's a given thing, because the
Right.
resources that have to be deployed will probably come in bulk from the government.
Yeah.
But would it be prudent to have the research done
Conducted
by
within the government.
private sector? Just like following the example of DARPA, NASA, and there was a
Yeah.
fascinating paper by Ajay Shah and others where they compared NASA with ISRO and the French
Yeah.
defense production system with India's, and
Yeah.
they showed that 80% of what these other organizations do is like outsourced to private sector, whereas in
Yeah.
India it's the opposite, right? And so their
Yeah.
suggestion was their recommendation was that we need to bring in more private sector into the research that's being done out of the
Yeah.
government laboratories as such. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
in a way, funded by government, but sort of like a sort of model, like in which even these
Absolutely.
laboratories work in the US, right? Government operated,
Yeah. Yeah.
government owned, but
I don't think, yeah,
contracted.
I don't think government's comparative advantage is not in doing the research,
Hmm.
but in actually supporting the research, right? So they should let 1,000 flowers bloom, because the
Right,
key problem in research is identifying the right questions that are promising.
right.
Where, okay, like if I start investing today, I'm actually going to get some outcomes in the future versus this is a dead end.
Hmm.
And people will disagree on that. Right? And so the government actually needs to fund both the proponents and the dissidents of the same theory. Right? So in the end, they're actually supporting multiple different approaches. Another reason is that the process of research is like any other commercial activity where it needs to be well organized, well supported, it needs to have good management practices. And we know that when this kind of work is within the public sector, it is often much less efficient than it could be. Right? And so what we've seen is in other countries, yes, there is a small amount of public funding on governments doing the research themselves. And I'll talk about why that's helpful, but a majority of it has to actually go out of the government, not just to industry, but also to universities and other researchers and organizations. And a large part of it cannot be done within the government. The reason it's helpful to have some of it within the government is actually helps the government to build connective tissue with these institutions or organizations. It will help them understand who should be funded, what should be funded, and so having a few scientists like the NIH, for example, the National Institute of Health, does do internal research, but a vast majority of its budget goes to supporting others, right? And so that I think is a good model, because then the government is not totally disconnected from the money that they're spending. But at the same time, they're not doing most of it themselves, because that's not really their comparative advantage. The comparative advantage is supporting a bigger ecosystem. So I agree with you, basically.
So, just like we talked about these factors that are important for innovation, since your work also, you've also advised startups and companies as far as their innovation strategy, data strategy goes, right? So, I just wanted to understand what, in your opinion, drives innovation in companies. So, what needs to change in India, for example, to get more private sector companies to start investing in R&D, right? Because
Yeah.
that's an abysmal percentage, right? Even the sector that invests highest in India, that is a pharmaceutical sector, does very poorly when compared to its global
Yeah.
peers, right? So what
Yeah.
drives innovation in companies as such?
Yeah, so I think that's a fascinating topic, and lots of management theory and empirical work actually looks at that issue. Obviously, it has to start at the very top. Unlike other aspects of company management, innovation really has to be a priority at the leadership level. It's almost the same problem that I talked about with politicians, but in a smaller scale, right? Because if you're the CEO and your pay is tied to the stock market returns,
Mhm.
innovation R&D investment is not going to pay off in the next quarter. It might not even pay off next year. These are long-term bets that again, 4 out of 5 of them will not pay off, but one of them will pay off handsomely. Right? So if you're making only one bet, then it's a very risky proposition. But if you're actually investing in a variety of different projects and really have that mindset of allowing for failure and being okay with failure, then that leads to more positive outcomes in terms of investment, right? And so first thing is really has to start with the top internally and also from external stakeholders that yes, this is a priority for us. We're going to be patient. We're going to understand the nature of the process. So that's kind of step one. Step two is then, okay, once we have decided to invest the right amount of money, how is the best way to make that work? And this really depends on a case by case level. Sometimes companies invest in so-called skunk works. So they actually want to separate the R&D division from the core division. So as not to, for the R&D division to not have to have the pressures of the day-to-day management. So having some amount of separation or independence is very helpful. Otherwise, what happens is people who are ostensibly researchers are meant to be doing basic research, but actually then supporting very mundane corporate decision making, right? And so we've seen examples of this like Microsoft Research or Google Labs, where they have been quite separate from the main organization and allowed to work on whatever topics, more of a bottom up approach rather than one that's driven by business needs. Although in the corporate world, there's always that push and pull. It's much more, which is why governments can do a much better job at this. That why are we doing this? Like, what's the bottom line? And finally, again, they can't do it alone, right? And so there are models around open innovation, supporting an external innovation ecosystem, liaisoning with scientists and innovators in other areas. So how can they leverage the external organization in order to come in and help them and leverage them? So lots of different mechanisms for companies to innovate. But I think the bottleneck often tends to be not so much that they can't do it, but almost the willingness, right? And the patience and the investment that is lacking within companies in India.
So how can governments help in this, right? So what are the sort of policies that governments can pursue, which will help incentivize private sector to? And I guess there'll be different policies for different types of like sizes of organizations. I guess
Yeah,
different for startups, different for large organizations.
yeah.
So what in your opinion could be some of the
Great,
policies?
great question. So let me take those two different sectors, like startups versus larger companies. With startups, often the biggest thing governments can do is cut red tape. So make it really easy to both succeed but also to fail. So founding a business, registering a business, getting the permissions you need, things like that can be surprisingly effective. The cost of capital, the lower the if the loan programs that are supporting innovation at a pretty low cost, that can really be effective. Infrastructure is also really helpful, such as now we're talking about AI. It's often very costly to do the kind of compute required. So, can government set up infrastructure that helps ease startups entering? For larger firms, the most common government policy are the so-called R&D tax credits, which is saying, okay, if you spend a certain amount of money on R&D, then you won't have to pay tax. So like, rather than paying tax, firms are incentivized to do R&D instead. Those are effective, and researchers found that they can incentivize firms to invest. But I don't think they're enough often. And especially if you think the barriers are really cultural and are coming from more of not having a culture of R&D, governments can do a lot more to promote firms that do R&D and celebrate them. I feel like, I know we talk about Israel, but what are the private sector companies that are the equivalent of that are investing even though none of their peers are? Right? And it takes a really brave company to do that kind of research. And I think governments can also have a role to play in terms of in terms of shaping and starting that conversation, right? So we often talk about in India, sports and movies are two big things, but I think we need to be just celebrating our innovators much more, both in the corporate sector and in startups.
So, what is the correlation between wealth and entrepreneurship or innovation, right? I'm asking this because the companies in India who are big in terms of revenue don't invest a lot in R&D. So, but what's the correlation that we see around the world, and why is it that in India we don't see that?
Yeah, usually, so we can think about this both at an individual level, right? Like, are rich people more likely to found a startup or do something innovative as compared to poor people? And also similarly, are richer companies. In that literature, it's called more like Slack. Like if you have a lot of Slack revenue, does that lead to more R&D investment? And the answer is more clear cut with companies than it is with people. With companies, we do see a very strong correlation between the profitability or larger the companies, the more they invest in basic R&D. Because basic R&D is a scale game, right? So one investment won't pay off. You need to invest significantly across diverse set of projects and be patient. Only larger companies really have the right portfolio to do that, and that's fine. I think the problem in India is even the larger companies aren't doing that. So we don't expect the small and medium enterprises to have a giant R&D budget, but we do expect our bigger companies to do, and they don't. On the individual level, it's much more complicated, right? So in India, we often talk about jugaad innovation. A lot of innovation comes from people who don't have the resources. It's almost that a lack of resources leads to innovation. And when you have a lot of resources, you're very happy with the status quo. And there's a lot of support for that role. So what the researchers found is that the relationship between wealth and entrepreneurship is quite flat for the first 95th percentile of income. At the very top, it starts to play a role. Where the richer you are, the more likely you are to be entrepreneurial or start your own business. But for the majority of the population, it does not seem to matter, right? So we have so many friends who are pretty well off and have enough of a bank balance to keep them going for a few years, but they are not lining up to start a company, right?
Yeah.
So the lack of wealth is not the constraint. While there are many others who we see around us who are pretty poor, and it's actually out of that poverty that new ideas and innovations are coming out. And so wealth need not be a barrier, especially for entrepreneurship.
You talked about culture also, right? So there's the aspect of tolerating failures, right? For example, even at NASA and at other and the way the vaccines were also developed, right? You invest in different types of the same product probably, and then one of them works. So there's some amount of wasteful expenditure that you have to tolerate. And there's that evolutionary aspect also, right, to innovation, that there'll be variation, and then there'll be a survival of the fittest sort of, right. There'll be selection, and so that sort of culture change also needs to happen. What do you say?
Absolutely, right? And you mentioned some amount of waste. Actually, most of it is waste. So that's very hard and it's a bit like that old saying about marketing, right? Like I could slash my ad spend by half, except I don't know which half to slash. Right? Because if you knew ex ante that this project is not going to pay off, of course you wouldn't invest.
Right.
The problem is that the process of investing is itself the process of learning, and 9 out of 10 things will fail. Right? And so really being okay with that is really, really painful. Even so, we talk about India, right? But often Europeans are complaining about why is it that in the US they can innovate, in Europe they can't. And even within the US, Boston and New York are saying, hey, why can Silicon Valley do this, but we can't do this at the same level? So I would say, especially Silicon Valley is one of the very, very unusual places where people are completely okay with this kind of quote unquote waste, right? In a way that it's very, very hard to build that kind of culture. And the only way to build it is by experiencing the positives of having gone through it once But going through it one time is really hard. I mean, we're seeing this with science spending in the US, right? So US typically, even at the highest levels, has had a lot of patience
Mhm.
for so-called wasteful spending, right? So ever so often a politician will come up and point out to a grant. Like my favorite example recently was they were a grant to get a scorpion to run on a treadmill. And they're like, why are we doing this? This seems like a total waste of public money. But it turned out that, like in the fishing industry, this was a very useful application to improve the productivity of how you would fish. And in many cases, like things that seem completely useless, even in the immediate run, they were useless. But 10 or 20 years ago, someone discovered a usefulness for it that turned out to be really valuable. Right. So these things are extremely non-linear, and so I think it really has to come from experience and education. And these really giving these case studies of how weird the process is, and really building a stomach for that kind of failure is I think the only way to go, and that's why it's so hard. Like most places in the
Mm.
world, not just India, really struggle with building that kind of culture.
One of my favorite examples is the recent example of DeepSeek, right? So in China, right, the Chinese government sort of had a crackdown on what sort of industries we need to focus on, not these online gaming and e-commerce sort of things, but something that focuses on national development and those sorts of things. But
Hmm.
but despite that, companies like DeepSeek or Firefly, which focuses on AI, algorithmic training, and all of that, right? That's where the innovation came up, right? So that's probably one example where applying top-down measures, as in aligning all activity or all innovation towards national ideals or national goals, is probably not something that works out, right? You need to have that thousand flowers bloom, first to say. Yeah. Uh,
Absolutely right. So it's very hard to like micromanage this process.
right.
I think you can set some broad priorities of these areas or these sectors are important, and I think that is important because sometimes the private sector again like it can be very aligned towards short-term returns, right? And so the classic saying is like we wanted flying cars but instead we got another better ad algorithm or another app to
Yeah.
play Candy Crush on. And so that just seems like a problem. So even these cultures don't have that kind of long term. So I think there is a role for steering it, but also very hard to say I want exactly this innovation, I want exactly this idea, right? And so I think the Chinese example is a good one where they've succeeded in kind of balancing that to some extent.
And the culture change that we talked about also needs to be there, not just in the industry but also in the governmental sector, right? So for example, often in India, like if you do some sort of wasteful expenditure, you'll probably have the CAG, Comptroller and Auditor General, barking down your throats and saying and hauling you up, right? So that sort of change, which is like a cultural change but which needs to be rooted in actual laws and regulations which allow say for example good faith efforts to be one basis on which you evaluate projects, right? That sort of a change in the laws and regulations also is something that would help the culture come up, because culture is not something very abstract. It comes out of laws, regulations also to some extent.
Absolutely. And I think there's an important role for those institutions because the same dynamics can also be exploited, right? So there's a lot of fraud in innovation. There's a lot of scientific fraud. There's lots of junk science. So like there's a difference between a good faith effort to innovate and then failing versus explicitly using the money and then siphoning it away and actually not doing the activity of the science, right? And so I think the way we will get there is, and even in these kinds of institutions, have to measure, detect, and reward the process rather than the outcome. Right? And so I'm going to give tax credits. I think which is why tax credits works because they're like okay, money spent on something that looks like a good faith effort to innovate rather than on the innovation outcome, right? So it's much more about the costs
Mhm.
rather than the outputs of a particular process. It's a very challenging thing in innovation to actually be able to measure that and to be able to see that, okay, somebody made a good faith effort to innovate in a particular area. So I think that will be an ongoing battle is as we set these rules, How do we stay guarded against these kinds of measures that exploit the system?
Right.
And that is also a culture change that's required from the people benefiting from. Say we had more R&D money, we
Mm.
want the people who benefit from it to also make the most of it. Not in terms of creating the best innovation, but at least making a good effort to innovate.
Right, right. I guess that's a difficult thing to do because, and that's why you have more production linked incentive sort of schemes in India rather than research linked incentive schemes. Why we have those, but it's difficult to measure the outcomes and then have a longer term outlook, right? So, yeah. So, since we discussed AI, and that's a good segue to my next question, right? So, what do you think would be the impact of these predictive technologies, right? AI in particular, and then generative AI, agentic AI, right? What would be their impact on innovation? What would be their immediate value, right? And a
Yeah,
longer on a longer horizon, what will be their impact on industry and maybe on the IT
yeah,
industry, for example? Yeah.
yeah. So my favorite way to think about this comes from my advisor, Scott Stern at MIT, who has a paper where they talk about AI as in what they call an innovation in the method of innovation. Right. So I talked about how at the very start of our discussion, like a lot of the world is about converting inputs to outputs. And innovation is a process of making the same inputs into better outputs. Now we can take the same lens and turn it on innovation itself. So innovation is also a process of inputs to outputs, right? So the more we invest in science, the more we invest in R&D, we get some new technologies, new drugs on the outside. And so what AI does is it makes that process more efficient, if it makes sense. It's kind of a meta argument, right? So it makes the process of innovating more efficient. So we just talked about how innovation is replete with failure. And there's these like the few successes, but the successes have outsized returns. They kind of pay for all of the efforts that you put in. So one metaphor that I like to think about this is like imagine um, imagine there's a room, a dark room, and there are these keys lying somewhere in the dark room. And your process is, and your R&D investment is the number of people in the room. The more people you have, the more likely, or the more keys you're likely to find. You can think about AI or predictive technologies as what I call a map that helps clarify that dark room and gives you a few hotspots that says, now I'm going to predict that, okay, this corner of the room, there's no keys, but this corner is likely to have a lot of value. Why don't you focus your search effort there? So for the same number of people, for the same number of inputs, now you get more outputs because they're looking in the right space. Okay, so what AI is doing is it's predicting where your search efforts are likely to be valuable. Now, that's a very abstract example, but a very concrete one is AlphaFold. Right? So, what Google and DeepMind did is for a long time, researchers would spend a ton of time and effort to map or sequence a protein. And so, after decades of investment, we do have really good maps of a very small number of proteins. And so, what DeepMap did is they took that as training data and they expanded it to basically every known protein there is. So, what does that do if you're a scientist? Is now it's really cheap to now you can write on a program that says, hey, try every protein for a particular problem that I have. Well, before that would have been impossible. I would have had to do it one by one. And so now that's going to make my search process much more efficient. It's going to make it much more likely that I actually come up with the right discovery for the same amount of effort. So there are many different modalities through which AI could help innovation, and it's a longer conversation. Some of it is just more mundane. But the thing that I'm most excited about is this metaphorical idea of a prediction, predictive technology, helping you not so much is coming up with an innovation, but it's telling you where to look, and that makes your input much more productive on the other side.
Right, right. The example that you gave of searching for the keys and yeah, helping out, that's fascinating. And but some could also say that there's this other story of a man searching for a key under a lamp, but
Yeah,
that's because there was light out there, but the key
exactly.
was somewhere else, right? So yeah, I mean, what are those sorts of pitfalls that you see?
Yeah, there's a reason I use that example, right? Because it's kind of this inspired by that same opposite side of this, which is now if AI is say there's like three keys, but only one of them is the right key, and AI is pointing to the wrong one, and all of us are rushing to that wrong spot. then the right key kind of left behind, right? If we're not even searching in the right place. Which is why I'm more excited about AIs that act more as floodlights rather than flashlight, like or like spotlights.
Mhm.
So a lot of what AI is doing is actually it's not taking a stance on where in the landscape you'll find the keys, but saying let's just do the whole thing, right? Like let's just do the whole landscape,
Right.
and then it's up to you to decide to what extent. So that's very helpful. So I think so we should be wary of situations where AI acts as a very partial source of prediction. It's taking a view because that's more likely to hurt or constrain us versus AI that's expanding, that's really broadening the search space. What we found in our research, shout out to my student Matteo Tranquero, who's at UPenn, who's done some of this work, is he looked at drug discovery. And so he looked at firms and where they're looking for a treatment for a particular disease. And what he found was that before this predictive technology, everyone was kind of hovering around each other, right? So if Arindam, you've discovered something interesting, I'm going to like do something similar in order to copy you. And he studies this technology that sequences the entire genome, not just a particular sequence of the genome. And what he shows is that A, firms are herding, it's fine, but many of them are missing big spots where there's lots of low hanging fruit, but there no one is kind of exploring in those areas. And also, this kind of AI technology then leads to a shift where we get more drugs and more innovation by shifting us out of these kinds of. So AI can both constrain and diversify depending on the ways in which it is applied.
Right, right. That's fascinating. Um
Yeah.
and since your research explores innovation ecosystems, right? So, how do you see AI changing the landscape of collaborative innovation across different industries? So, how does the process of collaboration as such change?
I think almost it's a bit like, 10 years ago, Mark Andreessen said, like, software is eating the world. So I feel there's an element to which that's coming to innovation. There's lots of innovation that typically had very little digital aspects to it, very little AI aspects or machine learning aspects to it. Drug discovery is a good example. But increasingly, more and more of the innovation ecosystem is becoming amenable to benefits from machine learning. Like I think when I think about the most basic field of research, I think about theoretical mathematics, right? And so if you're a theoretical mathematician, all you need is a pen and a paper, right? So you had nothing to do with the computer revolution. But even there, we are seeing AI having lots of value, right? So, and we are seeing that it's providing ideas of new theoretical approaches, new proofs, and so I think in terms of collaboration, what that means is now we'll see a lot more interdisciplinary work, right? Like no matter what field you are, you're going to have to engage with this emerging field and work with people in those fields in order to make progress. Like as a social scientist myself, I see myself collaborating a lot more with computer scientists and people who work in the AI field because I just see the applications of that to my own work.
Right, right. Now coming to the question of India as such, right? So, what should an AI investment strategy look like for a country like India, right, with limited resources? So, we have government officials like say Nandan Nilekani and others saying that we India should focus at the application layer, and probably we don't have the resources or even the talent as such to
Yeah.
be working on foundational models and the like, right? And
Yeah.
Sam Altman made that controversial statement, but which he has now suddenly after DeepSeek said the opposite also. So, what do you think
Mm.
India should focus on, or
Yeah.
should India as such focus on anything, or should it be left to market forces?
Yeah.
And if at all
Yeah.
government has to focus on some, what would that be?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been following the debate, right? Like so some people saying let's stay out of this. It's too expensive. It's too costly, right? Like so, Altman, like the people in it's mind-boggling the level of investment that even for the U.S. it's mind-boggling
Mhm.
that some of the investments these companies are making, and it'd be very hard for anyone, let alone India, to compete at that same level. But on the other hand, we're seeing these developments with DeepSeek that makes us question, right? Like whether we should be staying out of this game. How expensive is this really? I think there's also the problem that we only see DeepSeek as kind of the success, and they argue that it was very cheap. But if you read carefully, it's only the cost of training that one particular model. It doesn't include the cost of the entire company. And even more, what we don't see is the years and years and decades of investment China has made in everything we talked about, like university research, fundamental education across fields, right? So it's very tempting to say, hey, if China can do this for a small amount of money, why don't I set up my own lab and do something similar without that underlying base? So in some ways, that's, so I can see both sides.
Yeah.
There's merits to arguments on both sides. But where I come out of is this is just too important for India to sit out of. And even though we are kind of behind in the game, we should be playing catch up and investing significantly at every level. So I guess, less supportive of the idea that we should not be investing, or that we should be only investing superficially on top of what already exists. And I think there's a few ways this can be solved, right? So it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to lead to immediate results. I think the talent issue can be solved through our deep links with Indian researchers abroad. Like if you look at any leading paper, like including the most famous paper in AI, the Transformers paper, they're Indian researchers who grew up in India and are very interested in contributing back. The founder of Perplexity, who's a Berkeley grad, Arvind Srinivas, was in India, like talking about like how they wanted to support this ecosystem. So I think if we build enough connections with the talent, I think the talent is very interested in contributing back. I think another big reason to do this is because if you think about what these technologies are, in innovation, we talk about this directed technological change, right? So innovations are not neutral. They don't help everyone equally. We often have an app. So even when I'm inventing a drug, like there's a lot more drugs on prostate cancer than there's on breast cancer because a lot of the innovators were men and they're kind of solving their own problems.
Yeah.
And so we'll have a lot of unique problems in India that Western models and languages is the biggest one, right? Won't do such a good job on. And so if we want to see the benefits of India, we can't just ride off the coattails. We have to make it applicable to the particular problems that we face. And so that's another reason why we need this kind of fundamental innovation. And I think what we're seeing in just terms of where this industry is going is there is a happy medium between DeepSeek and the $100 billion or whatever OpenAI is investing. So I think with enough public infrastructure and an ecosystem of private companies, India could catch up, and that's something we should be thinking hard about at every level, including investing in foundation models and basic research.
Right, right. You talked about talent also, right? So just wanted to get your views on the recent debates on skilled immigration and immigration in general, and how there are debates in India also about restricting talent from going abroad instead of having more free flowing mobility, right? Instead of considering it as brain drain, consider it as brain circulation, right? So, what are your views on this? Interconnected talent mobility that we need to have.
Yeah, I think there's two different points of view, like from the sending country and the receiving country. In the US, it's kind of the opposite debate, right? Like that we want to restrict talent from coming in. And I think that the argument is the wrong way around, and research has shown over and over again that it's a no-brainer for countries to attract top talent from other countries, and that has immense benefits for innovation. Now, for India and for a sending country, it's more complicated, right? Because the assumption is that, hey, like if I took this smart and talented person and had them stay here, then whatever they would do abroad, they would do in India instead, and that's going to be better. But that's not exactly right. The reason that these talented people are able to produce these outcomes, like if we took Ashish Vaswani, who was on the Transformer paper, and if we said, look, let's just keep this person in India, and that doesn't mean the Transformer paper would have come out of India. That person needs the right, again, investment and ecosystem around them in order to innovate. So just by keeping or artificially restricting talent to India, I don't think is going to necessarily solve any of the issues. It's going to lead to a lot of resentment. And also, we forget just how deep the bench is in India, right? Like, so if we lose a few people, there's just many, many more people. Like I'm here in the US, but you're there in India, and you I know like scored much more than me in school, right? And so we have a equally talented people and equally deep bench in India as compared to here, and so I think it just kind of misses the point. I think it should be more like how do we turn that drain into circulation, so bring those people back to contribute, But also, of all the people who are in India, how do we really unlock their potential? One of the things about innovation is it's like you don't need a big sector of the economy to be invested in it. You just need a small portion, but the quality and how much you invest in them matters much more than the quantity.
Right, right. And in the context of AI governance is going to be pretty important, right? Even as we speak, there's the Paris AI Action Summit that's happening today and tomorrow, right? So, what are your views on how to ensure that AI is more inclusive, more responsible, or do you think those sorts of regulations would be too onerous, too restrictive, and we should have a light touch approach?
Good question. I think there is the risk, and this has happened in the US, where some of the debates around safety have gone too far to stifle innovation. But at the same time, to say that we need no oversight and regulation would be wrong. I think the right approach here is incrementality and connections between the different playholders, but between the different stakeholders. Constant discussions between policymakers and the innovators on the next generation of models, trying to get ahead of the risks, but also having safeguards in place. And researchers have created innovations now to tap in those safeguards. I don't think those are going to be perfect, but they kind of help. So I do think these kinds of forums are helpful, and we need our own. We need our own regulatory frameworks. It's no different than like the pollution board regulating industrial manufacturing. It's like because we have pollution doesn't mean we shut down all industry, but also doesn't mean that we have no regulation at all. So I think the discussion has to be, it all will come down to the details of how exactly we regulate that balances enough industry dynamism while at the same time trying to get ahead of the risks. And the solutions are the same as they've always been, and which is like a deep understanding and connection between two sides.
The reason I was asking this question was, President Trump, immediately after assuming office, sort of rescinded the executive order that was issued by President Biden,
Yeah.
on companies submitting their training results before deployment, right? And then that was deemed to be too onerous. So, if we go to these details, what do you think
Yeah.
could be the best way out, the optimal way out?
I honestly don't have a strong view on what the details of the regulation should be on the safety area because I kind of don't work in safety and responsible AI, and there are others smarter than me. Although, like what I hear from people in industry were that those regulations were overreaching, and I can sympathize with some of those arguments. I think I'm usually on the side of regulation till we need it, rather than let's try to get ahead of every problem and then regulate even before the problem happens. But again, it's all in the details. And I hesitate to say, in particular with AI, what are the right details. Mozilla recently put out something that I would refer your listeners to that has a much more, and I can share the link with you after this call.
Sure, sure. The reason I'm asking is also because I wanted to get your views on open source software development in general, right? Especially in the context of AI. Also, not just that, right? Access to data, for example, is considered to be one of the biggest moats for existing
Yes.
companies, right? So, what do you
Yes.
think data, access to data, and data policies do when it comes to innovation and change?
Yeah. Yeah. Huge question, right? We just talked about what can the government do to support AI innovation. I think we should be digitizing all of our traditional libraries in all of our traditional languages because the current AI models, even OpenAI, like they'll take whatever's easily available, but they are not going out there to do the hard work of actually making knowledge or data that is exists but isn't readable by these models available. And especially in the case of India, we have so much knowledge that's basically locked away from these models. Europe is much better in this dimension. They're much better at preserving their language, preserving their history, and making it available to these models. And so we just don't have that culture of archiving, preserving, digitizing that we need to do much more on, right? So that's kind of the first point. In terms of the value of, I mean, there's lots of things that in your question that I can pick at. First, let's just talk about open source for a second. So there's a lot of debate in the AI world about what open even means. And the basic conclusion, and I agree with it, there are very few models that are truly open. Because if you want, like even Llama, which is Meta's open model and is kind of the most open model out there, um, probably would get 50% on a 100% score of how open it is. And the reason is that in the world of AI, it's not as simple as just providing the source code, right? Like Linux is open because we just had the source code for Linux and we were done. AI is a process. And so we need to understand, both have the understanding or the recipe. It's like cooking a dish, right? So you need all the raw material, you need all the
Right.
ingredients, and you need the recipe.
Right.
And companies are very reluctant to share their raw material, exactly how they process the raw material. And then, of course, they're very reluctant to share the recipe. What comes out of the models, what comes out of all of this process is something called these model weights, which is where the analogy breaks down because that's not really edible food just yet. It's like a ready to eat mix that you still need to process to get something useful out of. And so one version of open source is that, okay, those model weights are made available.
Right.
And that's what Llama does. I still don't know how we got there. And there are a few models out there that are open end to end, but they don't perform nearly as well because, again, it's like in order to train or cook this recipe, your home kitchen isn't good enough. You need a giant industrial sized kitchen. So even if you had all the ingredients, you wouldn't know what to do with it. So it's a very complicated. It's very unusual in technology. Actually, a lot of technology typically has been quite simple and easy to transfer, not very capital intensive. But
Yeah.
AI is very unusual in the sense that the fundamental economics is just very different, which means that for open source, it's much more challenging because I don't have the industrial kitchen to cook it at the same rate.
Right.
I don't have access to the raw materials at the same rate, which is why innovations like DeepSeek are so surprising when they did come out. But even there, we don't know the raw material, and they're likely training on a lot of the same data. China has been really good again at digitizing a lot of the traditional, so these models work well in Chinese. So yeah, lots to talk about. But focusing on making it easier for these open source developers to get access to data because it's so costly to digitize and produce is another key intervention that policymakers could play in the AI space.
Great. That's this wonderful discussion. I'm just on a parting thought. Do you have anything that you want to share, or really maybe let's look at what do you think about AGI? Right? I mean, I know that's far away, maybe in the future or not, maybe. But what do you think about
Yeah.
that?
Uh, so I don't like to talk about AGI per se because no one agrees on a definition of what AGI really
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
And it really gets very muddled very quickly. And so I don't think it's a very helpful conversation to say when will we get AGI.
Yeah.
But I think what I'm really excited about is we are very early stages of seeing the productivity benefits of AI, not just for innovation, but more generally. So it's kind of like 1997 for the internet, right? We don't yet have the Google of AI. We don't yet have the YouTube or the Facebook or the Instagram of AI. And if you think those following innovations came on top of other innovations that were built on top of the internet. Once the internet became fast enough, okay, then we had browser innovation, then we had video innovation, then we got smartphones. It's all of those future innovations compounded the value of the internet. And so we are still waiting for those future innovations with AI. The AI itself will get better, like internet got faster. But really, I think a lot of the value will come from these complementary innovations, and it remains to be seen. The one that I'm most excited about, so far we've really thought about AI as a chatbot. Like it's kind of an intelligence that we're talking to back and forth. I don't think that'll be the ways in which our kids will use AI
Mhm.
10 years from now. I think AI is much more of, it's kind of like the processor of your computer right now. It's like a transistor that is there in everything from your radio and your microwave to your laptop. And so we will see the embedding of this kind of intelligence all around us, including in physical devices as well as in software. We are starting to see it with software. And the sky's the limit, right? When you think about it that way. And so that's kind of what I'm really curious about is how we will use this kind of intelligence on tap, as I like to call it, and infuse it into everything we do. And so it remains both an exciting time, but also a scary time for that same reason.
Yeah, and I guess that's a fascinating thought. But and I guess the scary part, or the reason some people have a scary version of AGI is because of its use in, say, for example, military domain. Right, military AI. Recently, Alphabet or Google also changed its policy on military work. Right. So, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, just parting thoughts on this.
Same as the transistor, right? So we saw these technologies applied. In fact, they are often funded and first applied in these areas. And
Yeah.
so we will need the same safeguards as before. But that doesn't mean that they don't have value there, because just such a general purpose technology that it will be a fool's errand to say that, hey, like this whole sector is never going to use it. And so, insofar as we've been successful in, fingers crossed, in regulating nuclear technology, in regulating military technology, some of those institutions seem to work. And so, we need to bring all of them and maybe invent new ones to really monitor and control. I think people are also on the negative side really worried about job loss. So, like the AI can now do what I used to do on a day-to-day basis. I feel a lot of those fears are overblown. But that's another thing that we have to have a discussion about. And there will be sectors of the economy where there will be job loss. I don't think there's any doubt. But and that will cause some pain. But again, thinking about how to make the transitions for again, like what do we even teach our kids is a big question on my mind these days. So those will be all interesting things that we will figure the answers out to in the next 5 to 10 years.
So on that note, let's we are at the end here. It was a fascinating discussion. I'm sure our listeners would enjoy it. I hope you had a great time too.
Thank you so much, and feel free after the discussion to double click on any of these things. My website is abhishekn.com. I'm on X or Twitter as Abhishek N as well. And you'll also find an email or a LinkedIn for me. So for any of the listeners who wants to respond or comment, any of those forums are open. And thank you so much again for hosting me, Arindam.
Thanks. Great. It was great having you here. Thank you.
Thanks.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.